Welcome to this talk, which takes you round many of the sites in Norwich associated with its historic textile trade. People are usually surprised to find out that Norwich had an important part to play in the textile trade. Norwich was a centre of weaving as early as 1174, and by the 1670s, 50% of freemen were connected with the textile trade. The Norwich worsted trade grew rapidly throughout the early 18th century, and the exports of worsted and Norwich stuffs captured a world market. In the late 18th and 19th centuries, Norwich shawls became famous as a must-have fashion item. Sadly, by 1900, only about 2,000 people were engaged in the textile industry, and in the 1901 census, there were no worsted weavers at all in the city. The last cloth was made in Norwich in the late 1970s. Bomb damage, slum clearance, and road schemes have destroyed many of the textile landscapes. But look more closely, and the legacy of textiles is unmistakable. We find traces of wealth generated in the city churches, public buildings and charities, and in its stock of merchant and artisan housing. This talk had its origins in a self-guided trail that I created on behalf of the Norwich Society and the Costume and Textile Association. This takes you round many of the locations associated with the textile trade and gives an outline of the history. In order to fit the trail into a 2-hour limit, I found that I had to omit some interesting sites, and I was limited in how much I could say about the development and demise of the industry. So I thought I would combine it all in a presentation, and this is the result. To start at the beginning, why was Norwich famed for its textiles? The answer is sheep, as the original raw material for this thriving industry was wool, and the medieval English wool trade was one of the most important factors in the medieval English economy. Among the lasting monuments to the success of the trade are the soaring wool churches of East Anglia and the Cotswolds, and the fact that since the 14th century the presiding officer of the House of Lords has sat on the woolsack, a chair stuffed with wool. Past governments supported the wool industry through various measures. In the 1570s to 90s, a law was passed that all Englishmen, except nobles, had to wear a woolen cap to church on Sundays. The Burying in Woolen Acts of 1666 to 1680 required the dead, except plague victims and the destitute, to be buried in pure English woolen shrouds rather than foreign textiles. In modern times, the wool trade has been commemorated by eccentric Norwich artist John Morris Smith, who produced decorative panels for Morgan's Brewery in the 1930s to 50s. His panels for the Woolpack pub in Golden Ball Street illustrate various stages in the wool trade. And here are some details of those panels. On the miners' side, the wool trade was a major driver of enclosure, that is, the privatisation of common land in English agriculture, which had major social consequences, leading to mass revolts like Kett's Rebellion in 1549. The Norwich worsted trade grew rapidly throughout the early 18th century, and the exports of worsted and Norwich stuffs captured a world market. William Taylor, writing in 1843 about the Golden Age just before the Napoleonic Wars, said, "Their travellers penetrated through Europe, and their pattern cards were exhibited in every principal town, from the frozen plains of Moscow to the milder climes of Lisbon, Seville, and Naples. The Russian peasant decorated himself with a sash of gaudy calamanco, and the Spanish hidalgo was sheltered under his light cloak of Norwich camblet. The introduction of their articles into Spain, Italy, Poland, and Russia soon made the manufacturers ample amends for the capriciousness of fashion in their own country." You can find out much more about the trade in Michael Nix's excellent new book. The C&TA made a small contribution towards the cost of researching and producing this book through the Geoffrey Squires Research Bursary. The Norfolk Museum Service has a skirt acquired with the help of the C&TA that was part of that export market. This is made from highly glazed satin damask woven in a large pattern of flowers in blue and brown, designed to be worn over panniers and undergarments and layering to achieve a voluminous bell shape. This type of skirt was worn by wealthy Dutch gentry and yeoman farmers' wives in North Friesland, Holland. Particular countries preferred different types of Norwich cloths, and this fabric was designed for a particular niche export market. The skirt shows the wealth of the owner, and the fabric is extremely expensive. The main source of the worsted version of these patterns was Norwich, where expertise existed not only to achieve complicated designs on a draw loom, but also to carry out hot pressing to achieve a high sheen on the fabric to give the appearance of silk. So who were the weavers? In 1415, the Norwich authorities passed legislation compelling all freemen of the city to become members of a trade association, thereby controlling the worsted industry through the various guilds. Medieval annual guild celebrations were held at St. Peter Mancroft on Corpus Christi Day, a movable feast occurring between the 21st of May and 24th of June, when all the guilds paraded in order of importance. The dyers, wool sorters and weavers paraded last, as they were the most important. The guild ran schools, hospitals, and controlled the quality and price of all crafts. An apprenticeship took 7 years, and children started as young as 8 years old. Now for a slight departure to mention Norwich's Guildhall, the name of which might lead you to think it was connected to the trade guilds. Traditionally, a guildhall was indeed the hall of a crafts, trade or merchants' guild. Nowadays it is often used to describe a town hall. Our Guildhall was built in 1407-13 as the Guildhall of St. George's Company. The guild itself was founded in 1385, and early members included Norfolk knights like Thomas Erpingham, Simon Felbrigg, John Woodhouse and John Falstaff. Each member subscribed a farthing a week. In the case of a member falling into poverty, that person will be given 8 pence a week, but the main intention was to raise money for an image of St. George. The guild held services on St. George's feast day in Norwich Cathedral, where there was an altar dedicated to St. George just below the high altar. During the post-medieval period, it was used as the town hall before becoming the magistrates' court in 1938. It now operates as the headquarters of the Norwich and Norfolk Festival, and Norwich's sheriff also has an office there. Strangers' Hall has a long history connected to the weaving trade. There has been a substantial building on the site on Charing Cross since the 13th century, or possibly even earlier. During the 16th century, the house was owned by Norwich grocer and mayor Thomas Southerton, and it is as a result of his entrepreneurism that the house eventually became known as Strangers' Hall. The first strangers to receive sanctuary here were Dutch, Walloon and Flemish refugee weavers who fled the Low Countries in the 16th century as a result of the persecution of Dutch Calvinists by their Catholic Spanish rulers. Thomas Southerton was keen to encourage these skilled workers to settle in Norwich because their skills in weaving textiles would contribute to the prosperity of Norfolk. By 1571, there were 2,850 strangers in Norwich. Within a decade, they made up a third of the city's population. Norwich became renowned for producing light and colourful cloths using spun worsted yarn, sometimes mixed with linen and silk. In Strangers' Hall, Lady Payne's bedchamber gives a sense of the vibrant colour that would have featured in a Tudor room. The bed is hung with a reproduction dornix, a fabric combining linen thread with wool, thanks to the C&TA which helped with the costs of furnishing the bedroom. This laid the foundation for the more complex cloth structures of the future, known as the Norwich stuffs. Here you can see a pattern book showing samples of cloth, which is in the Museum of Norwich at the Bridewell. By the end of the 18th century, there were 12,000 looms in the city. Norwich master weavers employed outreach workers who worked from home. This explains a feature of many older Norwich houses, the unusually tall attic windows with dormer windows at the full height of the roof. Working in their homes, assisted by drawboys, the weavers had control of how the design and colours were put into the weave. On receiving a commission from a master, the weaver collected the yarn required and was given a painted design on which a graph showed the crossing points of the warps and the wefts. There are still a number of weavers' cottages remaining in Norwich, which have the distinctive windows. either tall dormer windows or long attic windows. 2 to 4 St Andrew's Hill is a 17th century building on what was once a medieval thoroughfare. It has been used for a variety of functions, but you can see a fine example of a weaver's window on the second floor. The building was restored by the Norwich Preservation Trust in 1991. The Preservation Trust was set up in 1966 by the City Council and the Norwich Society to provide a practical means of saving and conserving historic buildings in Norwich. The 17th century weavers' cottages in Lion and Castle Yard between Westlegate and Timberhill were similarly renovated by the Norwich Preservation Trust in the 1990s and repurposed as business premises. In some cases, weavers worked together in small factories. Weaver's House in Mountergate is a former weaver's factory and latterly shoe and boot factory built around the 17th and 18th centuries. It has now been converted into apartments. You can also find evidence of the weaving trade in some of the old street names. Weaver's Lane is at the east end of St Peter Mancroft and now mainly a cut-through from Hay Hill to the market and sadly filled with bins. In the late 18th and 19th centuries, Norwich shawls became famous as a must-have fashion item. The well-known Norwich shawl came about because City Alderman John Harvey found a way to replicate the expensive and desirable shawls from cashmere using a combination of wool and silk. And you can see John Harvey's fine house in St Giles. You can also see here that by the 1860s, shawls were a big deal. The design will be clearly visible as it spread over the back of the woman's crinoline. In 1791, Philip James Knights won a Society of Arts Silver Award Medal for his large seamless counterpane, 4 yards square, woven of a lightweight cream fabric known as shawling. Knights wrote that the principal consumption of this cloth is in train dresses for ladies' wearing, as likewise for long scarves in imitation of the real India scarves, which are sold from 60 to 80 pounds, whereas scarves of this fabric are sold for as many shillings. Buoyed by his success, Knights presented King George III and Queen Charlotte with a shawling counterpane with magnificent embroidery hand-stitched by young girls, and more of that shortly. Following acceptance of this royal gift, Queen Charlotte appointed Knights as shawl manufacturer to Her Majesty, and his business subsequently flourished, with several shops and warehouses in London and Norwich. Shawls were a valuable wardrobe item, and Knights offered a cleaning service that would restore your shawl to look like new. This advertisement also illustrates the involvement of child labour. On the left you can see a child probably embroidering a shawl with the caption, "Train up a child in the way it should go." And on the right is an adult weaving on a loom with the caption, "And when old 'twill not depart from it." Norwich weavers were highly skilled craftsmen with a long reputation for the excellent quality of their work. During the 1830s and 40s, they produced shawls with a variety of beautiful designs which are distinctly Norwich in origin. It is to the credit of these Norwich weavers of the first half of the 19th century that despite fierce competition from other centres and the political and economic setbacks of the time, Norwich shawls continued to be successful. Queen Victoria had at least 5 Norwich shawls, and here you can see shawl historian Helen Hoyt showing off part of her collection. Although much cheaper than those from India, Norwich shawls were still an investment fashion item. A receipt for the sale of a Norwich shawl made out by a draper in Gentleman's Walk in 1846 to a Mrs. Fulcar of Brackendale was priced at £7, in today's value about £770. You can see that most women in this mid-19th century view of Gentleman's Walk are wearing shawls. There were many significant weaving families that have been honing their skills for generations. The Clabburn family were involved in the weaving trade in the 18th and 19th centuries. Clabburn, Sons and Crisp was set up in 1846 by Thomas Clabburn with 2 of his sons and Thomas Dawson Crisp, and became very successful. On his death in 1858, an impressive tablet was erected in St Augustine's Church, which is surmounted by 2 shuttles in a cartouche. He is buried in a tomb in the churchyard at St Augustine's, along with his wife and his parents. Elm Hill is the most complete Tudor street in the city. A major fire destroyed most buildings in 1507, but the properties were immediately rebuilt. During the medieval period, it was the epicentre of society, with 16 mayors and sheriffs living there. Elm Hill housed a number of weavers, most notably Towler and Campin, whose premises were in Towler's Court between 28 and 30 Elm Hill. If you go through the arch, you can see the Towler workshops with the wide windows on the top floor. And here you can see Helen Hoyt again, modelling shawls from her collection by Clapham on the left and Towler and Campin on the right. High-quality wool cloth relied on the expertise of craftsmen at each stage of the process: wool sorter, wool comber, spinner, weaver, dyer, fuller. Thanks to Helen Hoyt again for her depiction of the many trades in Norwich when Queen Elizabeth visited in 1578. As you walk round Norwich, you can still find evidence of these trades. Before the Norman conquest, New Mills was the site of a mill used for grinding corn and fulling cloth. Fulling is soaking and pounding the cloth to produce a firm texture and soft drape. In the mid-19th century, New Mills was used to pump drinking water from the river to Market Cross. What you see now is the sewage pumping station, which was built in 1897. It used pumping engines and compressed air to force sewage in low-lying areas to the treatment works. It is believed to be one of the only two surviving examples of this machinery, the other being in the Houses of Parliament. From the 13th century onwards, dyers occupied the foreshore throughout the central part of the city. The eastern part of Westwick Street was called Leicestery Row, that is Listers or Dyers Row, and it led to the Madder Market, where dye stuffs were sold. The Madder Market is a former ancient market, with records going back as far as the 13th century. The name comes from the madder plant, the roots of which were used to produce the red dye. This was used by textile manufacturers to dye yarn, most famously for Norwich shawls. Much of the madder was grown locally. Although the trade is long gone, the Madder Market is still commemorated in a street name, in the name of the Madder Market Theatre, a commemorative pavement plaque at the end of St John's Alley, and one of the decorative hitching posts in the lanes. Norwich had a reputation for high-quality dyeing, and Coslaney was known for its dyers' yards. Before William Perkins discovered synthetic dyes in 1856, Norwich was famous for scarlet dyeing. Early in the 18th century, a Norwich chemist, Michael Stark, had perfected a process which dyed silks and worsteds to an identical shade. So successful was his process that yarns and cloth were sent to Norwich from all over the kingdom to be dyed Norwich red. The industry was not without its drawbacks, however. The Dukes of Norfolk built two palaces between Charing Cross and the river in 1561 and 1672, but proximity to the river caused problems. According to Thomas Baskerville in 1681, "In this passage, where the city encloses both sides of the river, we roved under 5 or 6 bridges, and then landed at the Duke of Norfolk's palace, a sumptuous new-built house, not yet finished within, but seated in a dung-hole of a place, though it has cost the Duke already £30,000 in building, for it hath but little room for gardens, and is pent up on all sides, both on this and the other side of the river, with tradesmen's and dyers' houses, who foul the water by their constant washing and cleaning their cloth." The Wensum is supposed to have run red due to the madder dye. In 1850 it was reported that residents in Water Lane, near Duke's Palace Bridge, were taking their water supply directly below the dye works, and the water was coloured according to the dye being used. People found brown-coloured water the best, as the black spoiled the tea, and so did the scarlet. Water Lane off Colgate still exists, leading down to the playhouse, but the old houses have now been replaced with the former Norwich shoe factory, part of which is the Jane Austen College. There are various blue plaques or commemorative signs around Norwich to remind us of the industry that made Norwich famous and wealthy. You might not have seen this installation in the churchyard at St Martin at Palace Plain. It commemorates the various Norwich botanists who have been instrumental in developing that science, ranging from the herbalists of the Benedictine monks to Sir Thomas Browne, who coined the name botanist. He originally used the term botanologist. The installation also includes the Norwich weavers. And there is a group of spinners, weavers and dyers flourishing today. The magnificent Art Deco City Hall is augmented with bronze doors featuring roundels illustrating the many Norfolk industries, including this one representing silk weaving. Other textile images include a wool comb for carding wool, an umbrella swift for winding yarn, and a stand holding 2 yarn winders on which the thread is spooled ready for weaving. Norwich has been a notable shopping centre for centuries, but one trade was preeminent, and that is drapery or cloth in all its forms. Before the emergence of specialist shops, most goods were sold from the workshops where they were made, although many of the craftsmen also had stalls on Norwich Market. The market was founded in the late 11th century when the Normans moved the Anglo-Saxon market from Tombland, and it is still flourishing over 900 years later. Traditionally, textile traders occupied stalls just to the north of St Peter Mancroft, next to the Sir Garnet Wolsey, and clothes stalls still occupy that site. Although there are still many clothes stalls, this was apparently the last cloth stall in the market, and its demise was noted by the Evening News in 2022. Dragon Hall in King Street is a medieval trading hall built in about 1427 by a wealthy merchant called Robert Topps. This was a complete business complex to display, store and sell Norfolk goods and imports from Norwich and beyond. As you can see from the reconstruction on the right, the site is reached from the impressive trading hall on King Street to the wharf on the river. This rather unprepossessing shop on Pottergate is where cloth from the village of Worsted was sold between 1397 and 1550. Worsted cloth was made from long staple wool, which produced stronger, finer, smoother and harder cloth than ordinary wool. The term worsted is still famous today, particularly for men's suiting. Almost opposite is this commemorative plaque in the pavement using 2 bobbins to represent weavers. Until the latter part of the 17th century, there appears to have been no clear distinction between retailing and wholesaling. It seems likely that craftsmen with workshops on the main street realised the benefits of displaying their goods in a prominent position outside their premises, which led to the development of shops as we know them today. Here you can see the shambles in York on the left. The word shambles is thought to derive from the Anglo-Saxon shamel, describing the shelves that displayed the goods on the shop fronts. The windows would originally have been unglazed, with the goods displayed on a counter in front, with everything secured with shutters at the end of the trading day, as seen in the French example on the right. A similar example in Norwich can be seen at 15 Bedford Street. This was built in the 15th century and the original undercroft remains, although the shop itself is 16th century and heightened in the 18th century. The 18th and 19th centuries saw the rise of specialist shops. Norwich drapers would become famous throughout East Anglia. A trade directory for 1830 lists 31 linen drapers, 63 milliners and 13 silk mercers. Although ready-made clothes were beginning to be available, most people made their own or went to a tailor or dressmaker, so there was a large demand for cloth. On the right you can see a recreation of a draper's display in the Museum of Norwich at the Bridewell. In the 1830s, a new phenomenon appeared, the department store, which stocked a wider range of goods. In Norwich, drapers such as the Curl brothers, Arthur Bunting, Robert Bond and Henry Chamberlain adapted their businesses to attract customers. But back to the weaving industry. This declined greatly in the 19th century as a result of competition from cheaper production in Yorkshire. In 1826, a ball was held at the Assembly House in Theatre Street to raise money for starving weavers. The guests were asked to wear red, that special Norwich colour. In 2022, Heritage Open Days celebrated astounding inventions. I thought of the jacquard loom as an astounding invention, but one which helped undermine the weaving trade in Norwich. When Joseph-Marie Jacquard, a French weaver and merchant, patented his invention in 1804, he revolutionized how patterned cloth could be woven. His jacquard machine made it possible for complex and detailed patterns to be manufactured by unskilled workers in a fraction of the time it took a master weaver and his assistant working manually. Before the jacquard system, a weaver's assistant, known as a drawboy, had to sit above the loom and manually raise and lower its warp threads to create patterned cloth. This was a slow and laborious process. The key to the success of jacquard's invention was its use of interchangeable cards, upon which small holes were punched, which held instructions for weaving a pattern. This innovation effectively took over the time-consuming job of the drawboy. When fed into the jacquard mechanism, which was fitted to the top of a traditional loom, the cards controlled which warp threads should be raised to allow the weft thread to pass under them. With these punch cards, jacquard looms could quickly reproduce any pattern a designer could think up and replicate it again and again. The Museum of Norwich at the Bridewell houses displays of Norwich shawls, rare pattern books and a 19th century jacquard loom. The example in the Bridewell is a mid-19th century hand loom, adapted a little later to take a jacquard mechanism to produce the more complicated all-silk fabrics of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, thanks to the C&TA, which contributed to the restoration of the loom. The jacquard loom is often considered a predecessor to modern computing because its interchangeable punch cards inspired the design of early computers. When British mathematician Charles Babbage released his plans for the analytical engine, widely considered the first modern computer design, fellow mathematician Ada Lovelace famously observed, "The analytical engine weaves algebraic patterns, just as the jacquard loom weaves flowers and leaves." With his analytical engine, Babbage envisaged a machine that could receive instructions from punch cards similar to those used on jacquard looms to carry out mathematical calculations. Unfortunately, the analytical engine was never completed, and it was 100 years before Babbage's and Lovelace's predictions were realized. However, their work and the inspiration provided by jacquard's revolutionary weaving machine came to underpin the technological development of the modern computer. By the 1820s, jacquard technology had spread to Britain, where it initially met considerable resistance. Willett and nephew set up some jacquard looms in Pottergate just before 1830, and they were destroyed by drawloom weavers. The weavers were so upset they even tried to disrupt the funeral when Willett died. However, some Norwich weavers could see which way the industry was going and embraced the new technology. Despite increasing competition from other centres such as France and Paisley in Scotland, Norwich continued to make high-quality shawls which found favour with the fashionable elite. At the Great Exhibition in 1851, 5 Norwich manufacturers displayed their shawls and were highly commended for their work. The 1850s and early 1860s were the most outstanding years for shawl making. Shawls became huge, 4 metres long to accommodate the expanding crinoline, and characterised by brilliant colours and complex patterns. The spread of jacquard's invention caused the cost of fashionable, highly sought-after patterned cloth to plummet. It could now be mass-produced, becoming affordable to a wide market of consumers, not only the wealthiest in society. St James's Mill was built between 1836 and 1839 as part of an attempt by the Norwich Steam Power Company to prevent the collapse of the local textile trade. It was fitted with power looms to try and make the trade more efficient and lucrative. Originally, there were 6 buildings in the mill complex. The mill, 2 weaving sheds, 2 engine houses and a boiler house with a 150-foot chimney. Now only the mill and the engine house remain as a fine monument to past industry. Over the 19th century, the shawl developed from little more than a long scarf to an all-encompassing garment that almost took the place of an overcoat. But by the 1870s, shawl wearing was in decline. Dress styles changed, and the new bustle skirts did not allow shawls to drape well. Women were becoming more active, and a mantle with sleeves was much more convenient than a draped shawl over the shoulders. Although shawls were not worn as such, beautiful shawls were kept and reused. Here is one from the Norfolk Museum Service collection, made into a gown in 1860–70. Also, the mass production of Paisley shawls had robbed the shawls of their prestige. It could mean that a lady was in danger of seeing her cook wearing the same style of shawl. An industry which had lasted for 500 years was sadly over and was replaced with shoemaking, brewing, chocolate making, engineering, insurance and banking, so that the city's prosperity continued. But the silk industry managed to hold on for a few more years. Silk cloth had been made in Norwich for many years. Albion spinning mills were built in 1836 for making worsted silk and mohair, before being converted for making confectionery, and then used for many years as the Reed Woodrow flour mill. The building has now been redeveloped into riverside apartments. In 1856, the Norwich Crepe Company built a large factory in Botol Street to reinvigorate the city's weaving industry. Mourning crepe was made by crimping silk gauze by passing it through heated rollers. It was much in demand as family members were expected to wear mourning dress for a lengthy period following a death. Queen Victoria's lifetime mourning for Prince Albert also made mourning dress fashionable. And there's a drawer display of mourning materials in the Museum of Norwich. Francis Hind and Sons at St Mary's Works in Oak Street developed new uses for their silk, specialising in fine gentlemen's wrappers and ties. In the long term, it proved impossible for Norwich to compete with imported French silks and with the dominance of London and the Macclesfield-Manchester area. Hind's was taken over by Courtaulds and held on until the late 1970s. Its last major line was silk produced for shrouds, and here you can see samples from the Newman Brothers Coffin Works in Birmingham. Although the days of large-scale textile production are over, creative and artistic interest in textiles has continued to be a mark of the city's cultural identity. Within Norwich's museums, pioneering curator and textile historian Pamela Clabburn, a descendant of the famous weaving family, began to build up a superb collection at Strangers' Hall. This is now located at the Shire Hall Study Centre, and there is a display on the Norwich textiles industry in the Museum of Norwich at the Bridewell. The Costume and Textiles Association was set up by Pamela Clabburn in 1989 to promote awareness of the importance of the Norwich textiles trade through events and publications, as well as to support the Norfolk Museum Service through volunteering, fundraising and the purchase of items for the collection. The C&TA also funds research into the history of textiles through the Geoffrey Squires bursaries. Many shawls were acquired with the help of the C&TA and are stored carefully in the Shire Hall Study Centre. The C&TA has also been instrumental in ensuring that the right conditions are provided for all the textiles collection. In 1995, an exhibition of more than 100 Norwich shawls held at the castle was opened by fashion legend Vivienne Westwood. The displays and catalogue have been put together by Pamela Clabburn and volunteers from the new C&TA. Members of the public were amazed to learn that Norwich had once been the centre of a worldwide industry. The C&TA also seeks to raise awareness of Norwich's proud textiles history through events and talks. One of the most successful events was a trail hosted by costumed interpreters with exhibitions along the way. Past Glory, Present Inspiration was an exhibition organised by the C&TA in the Cathedral Hostelry in 2016. It contrasted contemporary textiles inspired by historic shawls also on display. Norwich University of the Arts is reinvigorating Norwich's role as a hub of textile creativity. The university runs several textiles-related courses, including fashion design and textile design. The CNTA supports fashion and design students at Newer. In 2022, Newer fashion students were set a challenge by the CNTA to create a one-piece garment inspired by the Norwich shawl. They were asked to use a single length of cloth with minimal cutting to explore and experiment with the design potential of the shawl, and these are the winning designs. The annual Helen Hoyt Student Award asked Newer students to design a scarf, and here are the latest finalists. So to conclude, do try out this trail, which really helps you to explore Norwich. You can find it on the Norwich Society website. Click on Explore Norwich and then click on the self-guided walking trails. And you can find out more about the Norwich textiles industry from all these websites.